YouTube just takes a moment. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We'll get rolling in just a second. Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics in Prose Live. My name is Beth Wong. I'm on the events team at PNP, and we thank you so much for joining us here to celebrate Tom Rosenstiel's new book, The Days to Come, in conversation with John Podesta. At any time during our event tonight, you can click on the link that I'm going to keep posting in the chat to purchase copies of The Days to Come from PNP. In addition to growing your own library, a book sale from PNP means that we are able to keep bringing content like this to our community. And also, it sounds like it'll make a great Christmas gift. You can ask the author and the conversation partner a question tonight by submitting it to the Q&A box, the button for which can be found near the bottom of your screen. Be sure to submit your questions to the Q&A and not to the chat to make sure our conversation partners can see it this evening. I will waste no more time getting to the main event. A masterful political thriller from the author of Shining City thrusts veteran Washington fixers Peter Rena and Randi Brooks into a dark world of cyberattacks, a new era of foreign espionage, and a risky classified plan to save the world from environmental disaster. Tom Rosenstiel's The Days to Come is a clever, gripping thriller and a cogent meditation on how to heal a divided country. Rosenstiel is the author of 11 books, both fiction and nonfiction. He is the Eleanor Merrill Visiting Professor on the Future of Journalism at the University of Maryland and a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He was formerly the Executive Director of the American Press Institute and the founder and director of the Media Research Unit at Pew Research Center, which he directed for 16 years. He was press critic of the Los Angeles Times for a decade. John Podesta is the founder and a member of the board of directors for the Center for American Progress. Podesta served as counselor to President Barack Obama, where he was responsible for coordinating the administration's climate policy and initiatives. In 2008, he served as co-chair of President Obama's transition team. He was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. He previously served as White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton, and he chaired Hillary Clinton's campaign for president in 2016. Welcome to you both. The floor is yours. I will throw it to John.
Thank you, Beth. And it's great to be here. I've really been a long time admirer of Tom's journalism and his journalism criticism. But it's really a thrill to be able to be here tonight to discuss his new novel, The Days to Come. As Beth noted, it's a political thriller that does a deep dive not only on the peculiar pathologies of politics and Washington, but of Silicon Valley as well. And I'm anxious to get to it. We're going to be going back and forth. We're going to ask each other questions, and we will through the Q&A function, we'll get to your questions as well, but I get to go first. So let me start with this, Tom. This is your fourth novel. The two central characters, partners in a DC consulting firm, Peter Rena and Randi Brooks, have been the through thread in all four of these novels. From a writer's perspective, how did you decide to stick with these characters? What's the method of developing characters that last over several different books, several different scenarios? And do you like them more or less than when you got started?
That's a good question. I've often been asked, why did you not pick journalists to be your heroes, since you're a journalist and a press critic? And the original reason that I chose them were that in political thrillers, you need someone who knows the whole story to be the hero, because that's what the reader discovers at the end. And the whole story in a political thriller often remains a secret to the rest of the world. If you think of, say, The Day of the Jackal, the last scene, he's burying the policeman is burying the assassin in an unmarked grave, and no one knows, the world never knows the story. So who is it that knows the whole story? I think it's often the consultants. The other thing is that when I was a reporter, I always had the sense that because consultants didn't work for just one person and had to kind of eat lunch in this town again, they were often the most candid people that I talked to. And as I did the research began to do research for the books, I got the sense and really got a strong sense that they often were also the most candid with political figures because they didn't work for them, because they worked for lots of other people. They could tell these people, they could tell the president or a senator or a governor what's what in a way that staffers often had a very hard time doing or were afraid to do or were frankly too loyal to do. So that gets to the second part of your question, John. Do I like these, how have they become the through line? Well, politics has changed a lot, obviously, since the first book was finished in 2015 during the Obama presidency and was published in February of 2017, right after Trump, was elected president. Politics has become much darker. The parties have, particularly the Republican Party, has become, insane in a lot of ways. And having these characters as a consistent through line has been a way for me, at least, to have a continuum where you can have some sense of how crazy things have gotten because they were there earlier and they can remember what it was like before. Whereas the political figures, they emerge and are sort of reflections of the moment. Are also often sort of diluted. I think political figures are diluted by their own ambitions, by their own philosophies or messianic ambitions.
Well, let me follow up and ask you a couple of follow-up questions. You have a Democrat and you have a Republican. Very unusual in today's circumstance. You have a bipartisan firm working for, particularly in the candidate space, not so much in the consulting space obviously on the corporate side. That's pretty common, but right. But in political consulting, very uncommon to have people who kind of essentially work both sides of the street. Do they keep each other honest? Was that one of the reasons that you kind of picked? Is that balance help them as characters to be sort of sort of keeping their eyes on what's really happening around them?
Yeah, and that was particularly a theme in the first book, where in Shining City they are brought in by a president who wants to choose a Supreme Court nominee who even his own staff don't want him to pick because he wants to pick an iconoclastic moderate. So he goes outside to pick these, to have they're essentially fixers. They're more investigators than they are consultants than they are political consultants to vet and then try and get the nominee confirmed. And so there's a real byplay between the two of them in that book in particular. They had met as Senate investigators, one working for Republican, one working for a Democrat, and what they found in each other is this sort of sense that the facts of a matter is what really matters to them, and the theatrics of political Senate investigations and Senate hearings appalled them, and they had that in common. It had to do with things that had happened in their lives long ago, and they were bound by that, and that binds them more than their political ideology. The other thing is, and so for me, it was also a way to kind of ruminate on what the differences are between Republicans and Democrats, or at least the kind of Republican that Peter is. And in one of the books, he says, he thinks the way that you make the country better is by celebrating what's good about it. And he believes in all of that, the flag, and he went to West Point, and all of that moves him. And he recognizes that Randi thinks the way you make the country better is by criticizing what's wrong with it. And he understands that about her now. And he thinks of her as a patriotic person, but he didn't really think of Democrats that way for a long time until he got to know her better. So, one of the things that you do when you have to write characters is you have to empathize with them, even the bad guys in a book. You have to understand what's in their hearts for them to be real characters. And so having people who didn't agree politically was a way of doing that. It became harder when the Republican Party got, unmoored. Peter is also really a soldier who found himself in politics almost accidentally, and Randi is someone who really loves politics, and that difference, I think, intrigued me too. Yeah. People who are in the Washington scene but don't really love politics, but they're interested in service.
Well, I wanted to come to Peter, and then I'll let you ask a couple of questions.
Good.
He's you picked. He's almost an accidental Republican. He kind of comes to the Senate in unusual circumstance. And that's, a theme throughout the novels. But he's probably the most anti-Washington, anti-stereotypical Washingtonian, I guess. He's a straight shooter. He's a truth teller. The truth is everything to him. He's fearless. He's not a game player. He's not really political, really. So was that just an exercise in fantasy? You've been around Washington a long time. You've covered Washington. Were you just trying to see where your fantasy could take you? Or does that give him some kind of special power to observe kind of the foibles that we associate with what goes on in politics, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat?
Yeah. I mean, I think that he, I met people in the military and in the State Department and the CIA when I was a reporter who I admired a lot, who were in Washington, not for political reasons. So Peter is here accidentally. I think that his superpower, if you could call it that, is that by studying warfare, and he just is not that interested in ideology. He's interested in tactics and what works, and he's very good at psychology. Like a poker player who plays his opponent or her opponent, not the cards. That's Peter, and so he's strangely good at political tactics and the mechanics of politics without being interested in politics. And that's part of his tension. And that tension has ratcheted up as politics has become uglier, and the things that he sort of liked about it at the beginning have disappeared.
And the fire gets turned on him, of course, too.
Yes, in this book, the fire gets turned on him. And in fact, actually, it was a suggestion from some Hollywood people who said, your stories are bigger than the problems that your characters face. Peter needs, you need to throw bigger problems at them. And so that's what happened in this novel. So I want to, okay, let me turn the tables.
Okay.
One of the themes or premises of the book is that the president, this new president who's a Silicon Valley billionaire, proposes using classified budgets for secret programs to fund an enormous climate initiative on the grounds that global warming is a national security crisis. So my question is, as someone who handled climate in the Obama administration, in real life, have there been secret programs and classified budgets to work on climate because the national security folks are more alarmed by this than maybe Congress is?
You're asking that from a programmatic level. And I think that in the intelligence community, there's intelligence gathering and analysis, and then there's operations and program. And so I think that it's definitely been a keen topic of the intelligence community, trying to predict the outcomes. I remember back really probably 15 years ago, being engaged along with some colleagues from, at the time, CSIS, who then went on to found CNAS. Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy, both. Kurt's back in the government. Michelle served as Undersecretary of Defense in the Obama administration, being asked to help them think through what were the likely security consequences of climate in terms of destabilization, state failure, loss of food and water, human migration, et cetera, et cetera. And that turned into an important document that really began, I think, to get the attention of policymakers to crank up the needed effort to change the trajectory of where we are headed. And so those voices, I think, were really quite powerful. But in the climate space, I don't know whether they're. It's not that I can't say. I don't know whether there's been real money spent with the idea of solving the energy crisis or the climate crisis, coming out of the programmatic budgets of the intelligence agencies. That has been historically true, though. So I don't think it's a far-fetched hypothesis. The black budgets are used for all kinds of technology development, particularly in the aerospace and space communities. They've led the way. They've kind of, and there was a lot of pressure. I just finished Doug Brinkley's book on the space program and going to the moon, and it's kind of the joint biography of Jack Kennedy and Wernher von Braun, and the decision to keep the program, to create NASA, keep the program on the civilian side and in the public sphere was quite controversial, actually, I think. And it was Johnson as well as Kennedy who decided that this program, in part because the whole point of it was to kind of race with the Soviet Union, needed to be developed on the civilian side. But for in many technologies, including in things beyond just hardware and artificial intelligence and other technologies that led to the development of the internet, those have been done through Pentagon programs, often in a classified form. So the idea that you would tackle the most important security problem using assets, and sometimes in a classified form, as I think was an interesting feature of this book.
Yeah, well, and let me just follow up with that, because I want to be, before you ask me another question, I want to ask you another. One of the points, one of the themes in the book also is that climate is the kind of thing that it is so big, and requires such farsightedness to deal with that it's very hard to deal with in the political realm, where folks don't want to have to give up things, and they're reluctant about government getting involved in the marketplace, and so he's just persuaded that that doing this in secret is the only way to do it, because the political process won't accommodate it. Is that the conundrum we're in here? Do you think? I mean, do we have the political will to do what we need to do?
Well, look, we're going through this exercise right now, Tom, in the form of the major investments Biden's proposed that have now passed the House. They face one. I described it as that we've made a great leap forward through the House passage. We now have to climb an Appalachian mountain to get to the promised land. It's what's happened with climate, somewhat like the rest of politics. You even saw with the attacks on the few Republican members who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the tremendous division we now have in politics, which is that at a political level, it's become a partisan issue. That's not true in the public, where there's a spectrum. Democrats find it more salient. They want more action quicker, and they're probably willing to do more. But basically, there's a majority of Republicans that want action on climate change as well. But in the political environment, it's become a partisan issue. And it's why you see there's some enabling, got to go to the here and now. There's some good stuff in the infrastructure bill that's passed and now signed into law by the president that will help enable charging stations, some, focus on resilience, et cetera, transmission. But the big climate investments are in the partisan reconciliation package. And that's the nature of our politics. The question, I think, though, and I think what Biden has tried to do, what we encouraged him to do, from those of us who work on it from the outside. I'm sitting here in the new Center for American Progress offices. What we were trying to do in 2020 is tell the good news story. Don't make this only about a question of price and pain. Make it a story about resetting the economy, the opportunity that entails, the innovation that can come from it, the job creation that is broadly spread and reaches every corner of the country. I think that without hope, without optimism, it's very, very hard to get politics done. But sort of coming at that was, and Trump tried this with Biden, and particularly in Pennsylvania, was to attack him for costing jobs, raising prices, et cetera. None of which is analytically accurate, but that hasn't stopped anybody in politics in a very long time, and it certainly doesn't stop the guy who, the Washington Post had to detail Glenn Kessler to chronicle his lies on a daily basis. So it's if you go to Europe, it's not quite the same picture. The far right, and maybe that's what's happened in the Republican Party here, the far right kind of denies climate, uses it as a cudgel against people who want to take action. But the center right and the center left are more coherent in trying to, one might, again, there might be some differences, but they're largely aligned. That's not true, at least at the congressional and presidential level in the US, a little bit different pattern amongst mayors and governors who actually have to get something done. But I think going forward, the instinct to try to break the political system to solve these big problems, whether it's climate or it's COVID vaccines and COVID and resistance, not from people who are just nervous or have health concerns or have religious concerns, but from a political system that wants to use it as a identity and as a weapon, is concerning. And so in the book, President Traynor's instinct to kind of blow things up is pretty understandable. Actually, maybe picking up on that, maybe throw one back at you, which is, you seem to like characters in politics who are, rather than dig deep into the politicians we have, you kind of gravitate towards people like Peter Rena or like President Traynor, who are coming from a different place, seeing the world in a different way. So Traynor's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He's got a lot of money. He can kind of do what he wants. He's kind of a white knight riding into the corrupt kingdom to blow things up. And maybe back to you, is that your impression of what it's going to take? The people really sort of moving away from kind of traditional biographies of moving up through the system and kind of coming in from and being kind of this, mystique of citizen service. We saw a little bit in 2018 when so many national security figures decided they were going to jump in and run, and were pretty successful. Most of them came back in 2020. They were all being challenged in 22.
Yeah.
But how do you see that?
I think for most of my life, adult life, there's been a fascination with outsiders in politics. Jimmy Carter was the first president I was old enough to, that was the first time I could vote in a presidential election, was when Jimmy Carter ran. And we've seen that cycle over and over. I think Barack Obama represented that in a significant way, and Trump obviously represents it in a significant way. I think there are risks to that, and there are risks to that in this book. I was intrigued by, and there was a lot of fascination.
So the disruptor.
A disruptor.
Break the China.
The other thing is, I've been coming from the media world. I have spent the last 15 years studying disruption. That's all the people in the media world now do. They try and figure out how do you fix broken systems.
Right.
And journalists like to imagine that if journalism dies, democracy withers or dies with it. Although it may be the other way around. And so it was sort of a natural thing, being steeped in change management theory and Clayton Christensen and entrepreneurial concepts, to imagine that you would have a president who would come from that world and say, okay, the political world is broken. I fix broken things. I'm going to come into that. We haven't seen it. I think we will see it, although the bloom is off the rose, obviously, with technology. And I think we've seen some billionaires who've flirted with that and discovered that it's actually there's a lot to politics that's pretty hard and complicated, and you need to know politics. Traynor is a guy who, almost despite himself, has charisma and has always been the face of his company. He's a little befuddled by that. And he's not Elon Musk crazy, so he could actually get elected to something. So yeah, that's a little bit of a fantasy, but I think it's a fantasy that we are going to see. You're just going to see people who have come from the entrepreneurial world who are going to say, we're in this strange detour where people are really upset with politics and have turned to old men, to sort of fix it for them. That's very paradoxical. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's where we are. And then, the other thing that happens in this book, of course, is he does something that no one says can ever happen, which is he picks a Republican to be his vice president, which is almost a defining characteristic of Traynor. People say, you can't do that. And he's like, well, that's just because no one's ever done it, so I'm going to do it. And she's completely different than he is. And he senses that her differences are helpful. She, as crazy and as daring and as reckless as he is, she's the opposite. He begins to trust her judgment. And, that's all part of the setup before everything gets really effed up in the story, and things go awry. But yeah, it is sort of it was interesting as a reporter. The people who I enjoyed talking to most tended to be mavericks in either party. And a lot of times it was people who were not afraid to tell you the truth. John McCain was a really fascinating guy to cover. And I always get the sense that, talking to a reporter was not much of a threat to him after being in the tiger cage for, many years.
Yeah.
As opposed to politicians who, when you talk to them, all you could read in their eyes was, how do I get out of this interview as fast as possible because I don't want to make a mistake. And those politicians were just not very interesting. Whereas the politicians who were original and a little bit crazy and a little bit off always were. And what if those people could rise to power? And then so in the case of Traynor and Upton, you actually have two people who almost don't belong in their parties who end up in the White House.
Well, I want to follow up on this, but I have to ask one of the questions from my friend Laura Schiffer, who asks, so is there romance in this book, an early climate romance?
Well, yeah, I think I can give this away because it happens very early in the book. So Peter has a romance that's ongoing that starts in the first book, and the second chapter of this book, Vic, who is the daughter of a Supreme Court justice, gets fed up with Peter and breaks up with him. And so one of the themes in this book is Peter's heartbreak over this and his remorse over how all the ways that he has screwed this up and screwed up a lot of things in his life. So yes.
And how do you grovel your way back into good graces?
Yeah, right.
We've all been there.
It takes a long time, and you don't know what happens. I'm not going to give anything away, but yes, Lois, there is. If the sex parts of the part you're interested in, they're in this book.
So, although this is event is virtual, it's obviously being sponsored by our good friends at Politics and Prose. So I think you can kind of view this as a Washington event, even though we're not physically together. We're at least both in Washington or in the Washington area. So the good news, I think, in this book for us who are swamp dwellers and actually live here is that Washington corruption seems like the minor leagues compared to Silicon Valley corruption. And maybe reflect on that a little bit, Tom.
Yeah, well, you touched on it already, John, that Silicon Valley was started, basically with classified money. When I did the research on this, I was really struck by it. I learned even more than, it's not just that DARPA invented the internet. It's that the early technology professors, the professors who taught Hewlett and Packard at Stanford were at Stanford working on classified projects, defense industry projects. And so you have this strange situation now where Silicon Valley is kind of this libertarian streak that does not want any government intervention or government control. And when I did the research, I discovered that particularly after 2009, um, foreign money began to pour into Silicon Valley, starting with a Russian firm called Russo USA, which was, essentially Russian government money to invest in technology. There are a lot of, a remarkable number of the top VC firms and the top venture capitalists in the Valley now are from China, Russia, and other countries. And one of the things that I learned in doing the research is nobody looks very closely at the money. If somebody wants to give you a lot of money, that's fine. So there's a real lack of security. There's the FBI has one office in Silicon Valley. It's very small, but the level of espionage that goes on, most of it's civilian, is enormous. There's something in the book that's called the strategy of the human wave, which is a Chinese strategy to infiltrate and steal American technology out of Silicon Valley. I didn't make that up. That term is a real term. And actually, John, that's a question I wanted to ask you. When you were in government, what was the sense of security and national security, and technology transfer? Was that just kind of written off as, well, that's technology transfer in a global environment? Or was there a sense, since a lot of it started at the beginning of the Obama administration, that this is a significant problem that we need to do something about?
Look, I think it's gone in waves. When I was with President Clinton, we dealt with investigations that I think largely didn't prove much or didn't go anywhere about satellite technology. There were a lot of efforts to try to control technology that were unsuccessful, that were quite difficult. There was a blend, we're at the end of the Cold War. We had these Cold War structures for controlling export of technology that seemed antiquated. There was a kind of more support in the business community to open things up, let technology flow more freely. That would be good for everyone. But then as both as the intellectual property theft became a greater problem, as the direct espionage became a bigger deal, and as the Chinese economy developed with a focus on being a technology leader, and particularly with President Xi looking to be both an economic and security threat as a result, I think it is much more, it's a problem that is being worked much harder on both sides of the aisle. And that's why you see this legislation moving through that I think it was originally called the Endless Frontier Act, but I think it has a new name now, that is still, it still hasn't passed. The Senator Schumer was trying to attach it to the National Defense Authorization Act, but that didn't happen. So they're going to conference, I think, on that bill. But this focus, particularly on the pure competitor threat from China, is now, I think, a front and center issue for people. And, kind of well beyond, I think, even going back to trying to protect just the core technology around nuclear weapons that existed going back to the 1940s.
Yeah. So what would this bill do? This the endless frontier.
It's kind of it's both support for technology development and constraint, I think, on I think it's really more the affirmative, trying to do, in essence, what the Chinese are doing, which is name the priority technologies and provide federal government support for both the pure science and as well as the commercial development of those technologies. So
let me ask you another question, John, if I can, which is when I was doing the research for the novel, I was looking for what would be a huge, if you were going to do one really big climate initiative, what would it be? Recently, I've been reading that, and what I landed on was a fuel cell, a battery that would hold a charge for a really long time, not days, but weeks or months. And lately, I've been reading more that there's a coalescing of thinking around this, and that. Do you think that's the most important thing? And how far away are we from having a battery, a fuel cell that could hold a solar charge or a wind charge for a really long time?
So look, I mean, I think that's the wrong question. Because
I specialize in that.
Because here's my starting point, which is, I'm going to go down the climate rabbit hole, but there was a very important report that was issued in 2018 called the 1.5 report, which the IPCC, the global scientists, took a look at and a review of what was the difference between 2 degrees Celsius of global average temperature warming and 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they found was kind of shocking in terms of the overall degradation of the planetary systems, food systems, the ocean, et cetera. What it would mean to human security, what it would mean to species loss, et cetera. And it refocused people's attention. But in that report, they said, there's still time. We still have the opportunity to solve this, but it will require the transformation of the global economy on the size and scale that's never occurred in human history. So if you think about the problem that way, this is not a silver bullet problem.
Right.
This is a transformation of the global economy at virtually every point. The way we move people and goods, the way we produce power, the way we create sustainable buildings, removal of the non-CO2 gases like methane and hydrofluorocarbons. And if for the techno optimists or the people who think technology can solve it all, I think even Bill Gates wrote a book that kind of leans in that direction, but I think he comes more back to, we've got to attack every aspect of where we're polluting the atmosphere, where we're putting carbon or other carbon equivalent gases into the atmosphere, and begin to try to find alternatives, draw those down. And there's not going to be one silver bullet. It's going to be deployment of renewables. It's going to be improvement on batteries. It's going to be electrification of transportation. And we need improvements across that whole suite of technologies, but also in the way we just organize ourselves. And like I said this earlier, that can be a good news story. That can put a lot of people to work doing very important work and create a lot of good paying jobs. So it can be a good news story if we manage it right.
It would not be a good thriller. You need a silver bullet secret plan in a political thriller. You can't have something as diffuse as that.
I'll give you that. Mark Stencil asked a question that I want to put to you because it was a question I had when you said it. You made a comment about this disruption in the news business. I think you said many journalists think democracy will die without them, but then added, maybe it'll be the other way around. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, right. Well, there's just an extraordinary symbiosis and an unhealthy symbiosis, I think, between the journalism we have and the politics we have. It is impossible to separate. And I tend to think that journalism is reflects the problems that it observes more than creates them. But having watched this closely, you just cannot separate what has happened to the Republican Party and the rise of Fox News or other media on the political right. Polarization is also further enabled by fragmentation and a growing partisan media landscape, even on the left. There are academic studies out now that show that all media tend to give more airtime to political extremists on both sides than they are to reflect the actual makeup of the Senate and the House. And you see this on a daily basis on NBC, ABC, CBS, not just Fox and MSNBC, that the most outlandish statements are the ones that are going to get picked up. Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton are way over-indexed in the media, and so are AOC and other people. The demise of local media has, not the demise, but the diminishment of local media has helped something that I know when I covered Congress, I was hired by Newsweek to cover Newt Gingrich, and I spent a lot of time with him, and he talked about his dream of nationalizing politics, of having all people in the parties, in the Republican Party, kind of using the same talking points. He couldn't do it. He was sending out, audio tapes and videotapes in the mail to his acolytes. Here's how to campaign, and here's what you should say. The Contract for America, it was a very early attempt at doing that. It's now happened, but it's happened because the media system has enabled it, not because politicians have desired it or designed it. There's even, research that shows that when a local publication, particularly its editorial pages, stops dealing with national issues and only deals with local issues, that reduces polarization in that community.
Maybe a follow-up to that is, I want to ask you about Steph Meyer, a character in the book. Politics in Prose is the neighbor of Comet Pizza. Steph Myers, for a lot of people who go to Politics in Prose, they know Steph Meyer is sort of a character that loosely based on the guy who came up and shot up Comet Pizza based on the Pizzagate conspiracy. Kind of deranged by his travels into the dark web. What fascinated you about that character in that world? I mean, it was obviously painful for me to read, given my own experience.
Yeah. It's funny because when I started, so one of the things that's interesting about that guy to me, and he's not a major character but he's an important character, is that he's well-intended. He's a grammar school teacher who gets sucked into what's online and begins to believe it because it seems to make sense for him. Or it makes things that he can't understand make sense. And, as I did the research, and I think you even see it among the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, there are people there who were innocents in some way, who were swept up and persuaded. You see it in the documentaries that are done, like I like Trump because he's putting, he's stopping a pedophilia ring that exists, and who wouldn't want that, and nobody else is doing that, So it's the also, again, in the media world, when you do the research on people who consume a lot of fake news, they don't want to be deceived. They don't want to consume fake news. They think this fake news is telling them the truth about things that are hard for them to understand. So it's the actual sort of innocence of Seth Meyer that intrigued me. It was interesting when I started toying with it. I thought, okay, well, what is it he's going to start to believe? What's the rumor about Peter Rena that he begins to believe? And I thought, well, I don't want to do Comet Pizza. No, that's over with. That whole pedophilia thing is done. Like, that's just going to seem ancient. And then it came roaring back with more vengeance than I think anyone could ever have imagined with QAnon. That it may seem like a minor subplot, but it's driving our politics in ways that are hard to dismiss. Let me go ahead. Well, I'll just ask you one last question, which is,
and then I want to make sure we get the audience.
Yeah, we've got right.
Okay.
Biden's ratings are low. He's dropped about 12 points in the last few months. David Brooks wrote a column earlier this week in the New York Times saying that a president usually who does the most usually suffers the most in his midterm election or in the midterm election, but that won't reflect what happens in the next in his or her reelection bid. What do you think?
Well, having worked for two presidents for whom that was a sort of accurate portrayal of their political fortunes. No, I think if you look at historical trends, you would sort of it would make your stomach turn into a knot if you're a Democrat like I am. And if you look at Biden's job approval right now, it portends what we saw in both Virginia and New Jersey. I think the New Jersey elections were a little bit undercovered and surprising in their own right. Governor Murphy's a good friend of mine, and I was expecting him to win handily, and he won narrowly. So that's better than losing, but it was still an indication that something was going on, and I think largely reflected in the right track, wrong track, and the president's approval ratings. But I think there's sort of three things maybe that mean that the outcome could be different. And then one thing that is quite worrisome. The three things that mean it could be different is the Democrats are putting a lot of points on the board. Now, so did Clinton and so did Obama by passing the ACA. But the points they're putting on the board remain quite popular. And so there's something strong to run on. The other thing that in my mind is because those provisions are popular and all the Republicans are voting against them, there's a way to go back on the attack. So, in the Virginia race, Youngkin very now famously dealt with education with suburban voters and critical race theory and all the rest of that. Well, the Republicans all lined up to vote for pre-K for all, early childhood education, things that really make a difference to families, to kids, to the future of the country, really. And they have to be called out on that. And third is what you were suggesting, Tom, which is the party is being pulled to the authoritarian right in a really substantial way. And I think Terry McAuliffe certainly, I think, found that you can only run against Trump so long. But this is kind of real inside the party. It will be reflected in the primaries. And so there's still, I think, the opportunity for Biden to get the benefit of an economy that's on the upswing, get on, I think a lot of predictions that inflation is serious problem, going to remain a serious problem through the midterms, but could dampen, particularly in food and energy. And there's something to attack. And in politics, it's always good to have something to attack. And I think it'll be there. So did I answer your question? I think so.
Yeah. Let's do these last questions before we go.
So this is a good one. Josh Levin said, Tom has recently been asking social media followers to name their favorite political thriller, All the King's Men. For me, how has Tom been inspired by writing styles and themes of these classics? Who has he fallen in love with from writer to writer as he's evolved as a novelist?
Movies are not, are not helpful necessarily for writing novels. They're a different genre, and I love movies. I watch a lot of movies, and I love political movies. When you see political thrillers turned into movies, they're usually pretty different. Sometimes they're actually better than the books. But I would
stick on the novel side. Who have you really liked?
But what's interestingly, I had not read a lot of contemporary thriller fiction when I got my first novel published. I read the classics more. I would say that literary books have been more influential on me since I have started doing this. Certainly, John Le Carre has always been a favorite. I've read every book of his, and they are not, and they go well beyond their genre. But I would say that Elizabeth Strout is a writer who I am really influenced by. Anna Karenina I read after I was a published writer, and Shakespeare's plays. Macbeth is probably the first political thriller, and maybe still the best. So it's out of the genre that's influenced me the most.
Huh. I thought you were going to say George Pelecanos because you like to write about Washington, and I like to love his crime novels.
Oh, he's great, but it's a different
different genre. I get that. Okay, Heather Booth wants to know. It's a long question, but I'm going to summarize it. You implied directions for elected officials that they could take to address the kinds of corruption that exists in Washington. Do you have any concrete ideas, any advice about how things that we could do to make humane values of your protagonists have overcome the deeply divided and corrupt system that we currently have? What do we need to do?
Overturn Citizens United. I mean, the more research I've done, the more I think that has altered everything. Somebody said not too long ago to me, when she was a Senate chief of staff, you didn't spend very much time raising money, and so you spent more time on policy and reading your bills and working on the stuff you're supposed to work on. When you have to spend 8 hours a day raising money, you don't actually know what's in the bills you're voting on. So your likelihood to just go along and follow in line. So I think that's the original sin.
So we're kind of out of time, but Eric Plack asked the question, I think it's for me, is this the book that will put Tom on the New York Times bestseller list? Answer that's clearly yes. And Ellen Miller gets the final question, which is, you said of Rena and Brooks that the facts of the matter is really what matters to them. Where does that position them in an age of alternative facts and increasingly alternative realities? Great question.
I have a book here called Agnotology, and there it is. It is the science of creating uncertainty. It's This book was written about 4 years ago by a Stanford professor, and nobody wants to be misled, but it's very easy to sell uncertainty.
Okay, I think my last word is before I hand it over is buy the book. Put Tom on the bestseller list. Make me a truth teller rather than a liar. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And we can do it right here, folks. I want to thank everybody, our speakers included, and everybody in the audience for joining us tonight. I'll say again that your patronage is what allows us to bring these excellent conversations to our community. Politics and Prose is so proud of this tradition of great author events that we've established and been able to continue in the pandemic. So thank you both, Tom and John, and thanks to everybody in the audience. I'll remind everybody that the book is available on Politics and Prose's website and in the stores. And while you're on Politics and Prose's website, definitely check out our calendar of events. Going forward, we've got some great titles coming up. So thank you once more, and stay well read, everybody. Good night.